Today, I'm going to rank every Red Dead Redemption 2 character by combat ability, going from pacifist level all the way up to Terminator level in terms of combat ability. 95% of my viewers are unsubscribed, so if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe. In 48th place, last place, it has to be Sister Calderon. I don't know if this woman could even fight at her old age, and just like the fact that she's like a woman is going to hold her back a little bit. But again, I just think she's way too much of a pacifist and just a nice person in general to ever like consider shooting someone or even like pulling the trigger of a gun. I just think she's way too nice to do any of that. I think that's why she has to be in last place. She does have a lot of like old age and everything like that, and she's also just not the type of person to shoot anyone. So I think she has to go in last place. There's just no combat ability eking out from Sister Calderon. In 47th place, I got Rain's Fall. Pretty similar to Sister Calderon. I just don't think he's much of a fighter. Like, he's more of a lover, especially later in his life when he's pretty old. He knows he can't like really fight back like Eagle Flies does. And just in general, he's like a lot nicer of a person. He knows that violence isn't the answer because he already fought against the U.S. Army and lost. And like, I think he was the one specifically that like, you know, started the treaty with the U.S. Army, and then like his son eventually breaks it. So I just think at this point in his life, he's not really trying to fight at all. And I think even if he had the chance to like, kill a U.S. Army person, I don't think he would, but at least he has a little bit more combat ability and combat experience than Sister Calderon. So I put him a little bit higher, but still he's in the pacifist tier. In 46th place, I got Thomas Downs. Basically, Thomas Downs is a similar pacifist to these other two, but he also has a debilitating disease known as tuberculosis that he gave to Arthur Morgan. And well, even though Arthur like is still a solid fighter when he's on tuberculosis, Thomas Downs is someone that's pretty closer to pacifist, and he has tuberculosis, and just in general, he doesn't seem like he has any combat training. So this guy has to be one of the worst fighters in the entire game, but at least I think if he did have to fight someone, he probably would. So that's why I put him above Rain's Fall and Sister Calderon, even though his ability is definitely worse than the two of them. But he's still in the pacifist tier because I don't think he'd fight anyone, even if he had the chance. In 45th place, I've got Brother Dorkins. Similarly to these other three, I don't think he would fight anyone if he had the chance, but I think he has a lot more combat ability than any of the other three. Like, I don't know, he's a man that's pretty young, and he like seems like he's able to fight, but I just don't think he would. He's a really nice guy, and he's always trying to help people and save people instead of trying to kill them like all these other gunslingers are. So again, he has to go into the pacifist tier, but I think at least if he had the chance to hurt someone or like fight someone, I think he'd have a pretty good shot of actually beating them in a fight. In 44th place, it's Jack Marson. While Jack like clearly would not beat any of these people in a fight, I don't even think Thomas Downs would lose to Jack Marson in a fight. I think I'd have to put him a little higher than these other four, just because I think he is like a feisty little kid, and I think he would be able to fight back against some people. Like here, he's just beating the shit out of Arthur, which, of course, he's not able to do in real life, but I think he still could fight against people and actually maybe do something. I don't think people would actually fight back against Jack, but I think maybe he could do a little bit of damage, and at least he's more prone to fighting than any of these other people. So I put him a little higher than them, but still, Jack Marson, of course, is in the pacifist here because he couldn't even hurt a fly if he really wanted to. In 43rd place, it has to be Strauss. Strauss is also just not a fighter at all. I mean, I think he's more of a pacifist. Of course, he was doing some bad things to certain people, but I don't think he's really trying to fight people. He's rather had other people like Arthur do his grunt work. And I don't think Strauss even could fight someone if he really wanted to. Everyone throughout the game, they always call this guy, they're like, oh my God, Strauss is such a weakling. I can't believe he survived that long. But at least he has a sharp mind. Especially Charles, when he talks about Strauss's death, he's like, even though he was the weakest person out of us all, he still had a sharp mind, I guess, and they couldn't get out, they couldn't torture stuff out of him. So I just think Strauss is clearly a super, super weak guy. I think, even one punch from Arthur could just straight knock this dude out. So he has to go into F tier or the pacifist tier because I don't think he could even beat up any one of his debtors if he really wanted to. In 42nd place, it's Molly O'Shea. Molly, again, I don't think she would fight anyone. I think she's pretty much close to the pacifist thing. But just because she's in the gang and probably maybe, knows how to handle a gun, I think she's a little bit higher than all these other characters on the list because I'd hope she knows how to, pull a gun and, kind of how it works. So I think she's a little bit higher because I think if it came down to it, she would shoot someone and, fight against other people, but I don't really think she fights through that, and it's more of using her words and everything. So I think she has to go into D tier just because she's not a good fighter at all. In 41st place, it's Katherine Braithwaite. I don't think Katherine Braithwaite could fight anything, but at least I think she has a lot more experience than some of these other people, like pulling a gun, holding a gun, and like I think her family at least, can kind of protect her in that way. So even though I don't think she could, fight against anyone here, I think she at least knows how to shoot a gun. And like if things come down to it, she really could fight off, I don't know, one of the people in F tier. Like she could fight off Jack Marson if it really came down to it, but she's like 75 years old and I don't think could fight off any actual gunslinger. They can easily just manhandle her the whole time. So I think she also has to go into D tier. In 40th place, it's Reverend Swanson. Reverend Swanson was almost always high, and I don't think he could fight anyone in that state. And I think even when he stopped being high, this was not a guy that was much of a fighter. I mean, it seems like he always wanted to help people, similarly to Sister Calderon and Brother Dorkins, like after he got out of his drug addiction. So I don't know. I think he's a nice guy, and I just don't think he'd be able to fight anyone. But again, just because he's around camp, I'd assume he knows his way, like how to use a gun and everything. But I think if things came down to it, he would not be able to fight like most people here. So I think he has to go into D tier as well. He probably knows how to use a gun, but I don't think he would in most cases. In 39th place, we've got Leviticus Cornwall. This guy, he has so many guards around him and everything like that he wouldn't use a gun. He never needs to use a gun. I mean, even when Dutch was coming up to him and was going to shoot him and did shoot him eventually, this guy was not scared for his life. So I think he has some good combat traits and where he doesn't have any fear. He just knows he's rich and he doesn't think anyone's ever going to hurt him. But at the same time, I don't think he really knows how to use a gun, but his cunningness and everything like that, if he was given the way to use a gun, I think he'd know his way around it. I think he has a little bit better combat ability than any of these other people in D tier, just because he probably knows how to use a gun better and just knows how to manipulate people, which definitely factor into his combat ability. So I think he still has to go into D tier because I don't think he ever would use a gun, but I still think he's a little bit better than some of these other people in D tier, but he's still a D tier gunslinger. In 38th place, it's Beau Gray. Beau Gray, there's no combat ability seeping out of this guy. This guy doesn't know how to pull a gun, how to pull a trigger at all, but at least he is a young man and in this age, he'd probably be a lot more likely to use a gun, but it's whenever he's with Arthur and they have to fight off the cousins, it's always Arthur doing the work instead of Beau Gray, which is kind of pisses you off as a character. Beau, can't you do something one time? But I don't know. He would be okay gunslinger, and I think if things came down to it, he probably knows how to use a gun and everything and could fight back, but I just don't think he would, so I can't put him any higher than D tier. In 37th place, I've got Jamie Gillis. Pretty similarly to Beau, I just don't think he would use a gun, and I just don't think he's knows how to use a gun, but just because he's young and I feel would be solid in terms of fighting. I guess he does know how to use a gun because he does use a gun in this mission, and he shoots himself if you don't try and save him and shoot the gun out of his hands. But I'm saying I don't think he has I don't think he's used a gun very often is what I'm saying. And I just think in general, he's not someone that's gonna pull out a gun every time and try and fight people. But if he has a chance, I think he would. And I think even in a fight, I don't think he's the one trying to get into fights and doing all that. But I think if he does get in one, I think he'd be okay at fighting against other people. In 36th place, I've got Archie Downs. I think Archie Downs is a little bit more feisty than someone like Jamie and Beau, and I think would be able to fight someone off fist to fist, but I just think in general he's not the greatest fighter here, and I don't think he's willing to get into fights as much as some other people, especially when you go to see him in the minors at the end of the game. It's he doesn't seem like he's trying to fight back against them. He just kind of takes it. He's a little bitch. So, I don't know. I feel like he could be a strong fighter, especially because he's 17, 18, and that's a time when you're probably physically starting to peak and you're getting up to your top level in terms of combat ability, but he doesn't know how to use a gun or anything. So I can't really put him any higher than D tier. In 35th place, we got Mary Lynn, pretty similarly to all these other characters. I think she knows how to use a gun, especially just being with Arthur. I'm assuming she knows at least how to use a gun, everything like that. But I don't think she's the person to use the gun, and I just don't think she wants to get into fights or would be physically fighting against other people. So I can't really put her any higher than D tier. I don't think she would fight against anyone unless, it was really to save herself or to save Arthur. I think she would in that case, but I just don't think Mary's the type of person to get into a lot of fights, so I can't really put her any higher than D tier in terms of combat ability, just because she's not going to fight anyone in general. In 34th place, it's Mary Beth. I think Mary Beth, pretty similarly to Mary Linton, like, she knows her way with a gun just because she's in camp with everyone. And, like, I'm assuming Tilly and Karen, like, they're probably going out with Mary Beth and, like, shooting some guns sometimes just because they're in camp and they're around a lot of guns. But I don't think she's, like, willing to use it very often. I just think just because, like, she's a woman, like, I don't think there's really a need to do it as much as, like, some of the men in the gang. So I just think, in general, she's not that much of a fighter, and when it comes down to it, she's not trying to fight anyone. So, again, I think she has to go into D tier because she's just not trying to fight anyone in general. In 33rd place, it's Trani. Pretty similarly to all these other characters, I don't think he's just really trying to fight anyone, but I think he knows his way around a gun. This is the trickster man, and clearly every single time he tricks someone, he's not out here shooting people. He's not out here getting his way out by shooting. If he gets caught by the sheriff, he's going in, and, like, especially in the 3rd chapter, like, he gets caught and he goes in peacefully. So I don't know, I think Trelawney is someone who probably knows how to use a gun and knows how to do everything, and, like, his magician abilities might help him a little bit in combat, but this is not someone that's going to fight people. Like, every single time he robs someone, he always does it in a peaceful way. So I think, again, he has to go into D tier. In 32nd place, it's Penelope Braithwaite. I think Penelope is a little bit higher than some of these other people because I feel like she's just a little bit, like, stronger and feistier of a woman. And, like, especially with her whole family always, hiding her away and everything, I think she would be the type of person to, like, test out a gun and use it just to see if it works. But she's not trying to fight anyone else, and I think she just used it for her protection. So, again, she kind of has to go into D tier with all these other characters that just don't really use guns ever. In 31st place, I've got Edith Downs. Edith Downs is, again, more of a feisty woman. Like, I think she's definitely more physical than some of these other people, especially when she is a prostitute. Like, she is fighting back against some of these men who are, like, trying to do some bad things to her, like, especially, like, sexual assault. So, I don't know. Like, in that case, I think she is stronger, but of course, like, she's a woman and these are, like, really strong men, so she's not really doing that much to them, but at least, like, stopping them from pain or whatever, helps her whole thing. So I don't know, I don't think she's, like, really that strong in terms of, like, combat ability, but she is kind of feisty in her own way. So I think she goes a little bit higher than some of these other people in D tier, but she can't go any higher than D tier. In 30th place, we've got Angelo Bronte. While Bronte does own the Mauser pistol, and, like, I feel like he probably uses the gun sometimes, clearly he doesn't use it enough because, eventually when he does get caught here, he doesn't have any bullets in the gun and throws it at John. So I feel like he's just not that prepared in general. So this is someone that doesn't really expect to use his pistol that much and just probably isn't really that combat experience because, he's just super rich and super wealthy and he can have other people do his protection. And, like, if he needs something to get done, he can always pay someone to do it. So he doesn't really need to, like, know how to protect himself because other people will, or he'll just pay them off. So I don't think Bronte can go any higher than D tier because this is not a man that's, like, very physically intimidating either. And just the fact that he doesn't really know how to use a gun can't put him any higher than D tier. In 29th place, we've got Pearson. While Pearson does know how to use a knife and probably knows how to use a gun from his time in the Navy, I don't think this is a guy that really is trying to fight people a lot and clearly isn't that, like, experienced in fighting. I think anyone who's, like, a solid fighter could easily beat him in a fight, and, like, he's just not that physically intimidating, and I just don't think he gets into fights enough to put him any higher than D tier as well as these other people. But I think he has to go in the top of D tier just because he probably knows how to use a gun, and just all the time he's, like, being a butcher. He knows how to use knives and everything. He's always around blood, and he's probably not scared of it. So that puts him a little higher in D tier, but I don't think he can go out of D tier just because I can't really see that much of his combat prowess, and that's the reason why he's not, like, an actual gunslinger like everyone else in the gang. In 29th place, we've got Abigail Roberts. Abigail is definitely very, very feisty as a woman, and just the fact that, like, she's with John and with the gang, I feel like she definitely knows her way, like, how to use a weapon and everything, and would use a weapon, like, a lot more than any of the people in D tier. But at the same time, I don't think she's very experienced with using weapons, and it's not like she's using a weapon all the time. So I can't put her any higher than C tier, but I definitely think she is pretty experienced in terms of, like, using weapons and whatnot, and especially just being with John. Like, I think she knows how to use a weapon, but I just don't think she'd use it as much as, like, some of the people in the higher tiers, but I definitely think she'd use it in certain cases, especially when protecting Jack. In 28th place, we've got Tilly. I think she is pretty similarly to Abigail, like, going to use a gun in certain cases and knows how to use a gun just because she was running with the Foreman brothers before and now with the Vanderlyn gang. I feel like just, eventually she's probably learning how to use a gun, just doing everything with it. But at the same time, I don't think she's like a super experienced fighter, and while she's feistier than some of these other people, I don't think I can put her any higher than C tier just because she's not an experienced gunslinger. In 27th place, I got Miss Grimshaw, and while Grimshaw does definitely know how to use a gun, she, of course, shot Molly and, like, does have the gun at the end of the game and then gets shot by Micah. Like, clearly she's not an experienced person using a gun. Like, she knows how to use one, and she does use one throughout the game, but it's not like she's out here, like, roding and toting and sniping people from far away. She just knows how to use a shotgun and pull the trigger, and people explode from that. So I don't know, clearly, like, she's not as badass as everyone thinks just because she hangs out with Arthur at the end, but she does know how to use a gun and, like, kind of how everything works. So I think she has to go into C tier. She definitely knows how to use a gun, but she's not, like, super experienced with it. In 26th place, I've got David Getty. Similarly to all these other characters, like, he definitely is toting a gun. Like, when him and John do go to Laramie's ranch, like, he's out there shooting people and everything, but he clearly lets John do the lead because he knows John is an actual gunslinger, so I can't put him any higher than C tier. Well, he does know how to use a gun, and, like, I think he does shoot people if you just don't shoot anyone as John. I don't think he's, like, that good of a, shooter and, like, gunslinger in general. He's not that experienced to put him any higher than C tier in my opinion. In 25th place, I've got Kieran Duffy. Similarly to all these other characters, like, he just doesn't really know how to use a gun. Like, yeah, while he was a part of the O'Driscolls and the Vanderlyn gang, the one time I think he does shoot a gun is when he saves Arthur, and it doesn't seem like he's that experienced at doing it anyways. Like, during the O'Driscolls, I'm pretty sure he wasn't able to even use his gun the whole time. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's what it was. And, like, even with the Vanderlyn gang, like, I don't think there's many times where it'd be like, oh, let's go out with Kieran and let's shoot some people up. Like, he wasn't really using a gun the whole time, and I feel like he just didn't really know how to protect himself. Clearly he got caught by the O'Driscolls the first time he was out, so I don't think I can put him any higher than C tier. While he is, like, a gunslinger in the game, I don't think he's willing to use his gun as much as some of these other characters. In 24th place, I've got Captain Monroe. I think Monroe is a pretty solid character, and I think he definitely does know how to use a gun. Like, clearly he was in the army and everything, but I just don't think he does use a gun. Like, he's definitely a very pacifist terms guy, and while I think his combat ability is a lot higher than anyone else in the pacifist tier, just because he was in the army, I think at this point in his life, he's not really fighting anyone unless they're, like, shooting at him and they're, like, clearly his enemy. Like, he didn't shoot at the U.S. Army, and I just think in general, he's, like, I don't know, a really nice guy, so he's not going to be, like, going to fight against someone unless there really is a reason to. So I think, again, he has to go into C tier, while his combat ability is probably, like, at least B tier as, like, an average gunslinger. I think he could be even higher, but just because he doesn't use his gun that often, I can't put him higher than C tier. In 23rd place, I've got Karen. I think Karen, like, clearly knows how to use a gun in the Sodom Back to Gomorrah mission. Like, she is using a gun in Valentine in the bank robbery, but clearly she isn't, like, the most, useful person in a gunfight. Like, she just kind of catches people off guard because she's a woman using a gun. I think that kind of helps her and, like, is an advantage for her, but at the same time, like, she's not as good of a gunslinger as any of the men in the gang, and she can't really keep up with any of them. So I think she has to go into C tier while she knows how to use a gun and is probably pretty well experienced with it. I just don't think she has the same capabilities as some of the other men in the gang. In 22nd place, it's Uncle. Uncle clearly, might have been a good gunslinger back in the day, but clearly the lumbago has affected him. He's just kind of sitting on his ass all day, and he's not using a gun as much as some of these other people. And while he might have been a really solid gunslinger back in the day, the Uncle is Red Harlow theory is a very big thing, even though it's clearly not the truth. But, still, Uncle could have been Red Harlow back in the day, being a crazy gunslinger, crazy bounty hunter. And, I think even before, like, he probably was a good gunslinger, but clearly the lumbago and just him being really lazy takes away from his combat ability, and that means I can't really put him any higher than C tier, even if he was the best sharpshooter back in his day and was really a dead-eye beast. He can't go any higher than C tier just because he's lazy as fuck. In 21st place, I've got Hosea. Hosea clearly could have been a good gunslinger back in the day and probably was a good gunslinger, but clearly as time has gone on, he's become more of a pacifist and just, like, doesn't want to use his gun that often. He kind of always uses his words, and I don't even think he keeps a gun, like, on him most of the time. He just kind of, chills out without the gun. And I don't know, he's just a chill guy in general, so I don't know. I don't think he's often using a gun, and I think that's going to affect his ability. And while, yeah, he could have been a crazy gunslinger back in the day, I think there's only like 2 missions where he even fights anyone. So, if he's only in 2 missions fighting people, clearly his combat ability isn't as high as some of these other people. So I think, again, he kind of has to go into C tier just because he doesn't use a gun that often. In 20th place, I've got Colonel Favors. I think Colonel Favors probably was a really good gunslinger back in the day, but I feel like just the whole game, you clearly see that Colonel Favors, isn't that often using a gun. He kind of just uses his protection from his other men, and while he does shoot eagle flies here, which do you even remember that it's Colonel Favors who shoots eagle flies? You just think it's some random dude. But still, Colonel Favors does shoot eagle flies here, but I think this is the only time he ever uses a gun, or you ever get to see him using a gun in the game. And I just think he's probably pretty rusty at this point. He's an old guy. He's not that good in hand-to-hand fighting, and I just don't think he uses a gun enough because he has protection from all these other army men. He has 150 people in his regiment that he can just use to fight instead of him, so he doesn't really need to fight at this point. So I think he has to go into C tier just because he doesn't use a gun that often. In 19th place, I've got Alberto Fusar. Fusar probably does know how to use a gun. I feel like there's a lot more violent uprisings in Guarma than anywhere else, especially compared to people like Colonel Favors or Cornwall. But I think, again, he kind of just has other people be his protection. But at least during the game, you get to see him use a gun in this little Mexican standoff type thing. So I think he is, pretty solid in terms of combat ability, pretty average gunslinger-wise. He is using the cannon. He does fire against you. But he's not any higher than B tier, in my opinion, just because he's pretty much an average gunslinger, if not a little bit worse than some people, just because he doesn't use it as often. In 18th place, I've got Lenny Summers. Lenny, while he is a solid fighter in terms of just being an average gunslinger, clearly is probably the worst person in the entire game that's a gunslinger. I feel like every time you get into a fight with him, he's never doing any of the work. Technically he is as good as everyone else. I think Rockstar either debuffed him or made him a lot worse, because somehow every single time you get into a fight with him, this guy cannot hit the broadside of a barn and will not help you at all. So I just don't think he's a good fighter, and Rockstar clearly didn't make him a good fighter, so I can't put him any higher than B tier. I think he's just a pretty average gunslinger, and I feel like most missions you're in with Lenny, you're not really doing that much fighting besides the Battle of Shady Bell, or whatever the one you attack Shady Bell on. And I think in that one mission, if you don't shoot at anyone, Lenny literally won't do anything. So I think that has to put him into B tier. While he is an average gunslinger, he's definitely not better than anyone else in the gang that's a gunslinger as well. In 17th place, I've got Hercule. I think Hercule is a pretty solid fighter, but again, you don't really get to see enough of him to put him any higher than B tier. He's just a pretty average gunslinger, and while he does know his way around everything, he is as good as anyone else there fighting, I just don't think you get enough to put him any higher than B tier, just being a pretty average gunslinger. And there's nothing where I'd be like, oh my god, Hercule just made the craziest kill. And just even if you don't do anything, he's just doing as good as Dutch does. So I think he has to go into B tier as well. In 16th place, I've got Agent Milton. Agent Milton clearly is similar to some of these other people, where he just kind of relies on protection a lot more than actually fighting himself. But I think he does is good enough at actually shooting himself. I'd hope so if he's the top guy of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and he gets himself into a lot of situations where it's just him and Ross against Arthur, and who's a really, really strong guy. Even though they always catch him off guard, you're not going to go into that without being kind of sure of yourself that you can fight him off if need be. So I don't know. I think Milton has to be at least a pretty solid fighter. While I don't think he's the most amazing gunslinger ever and the most amazing combat guy, I think he is still solid enough to, take care of himself in a fight against most people. In 15th place, I've got Joe. There's not any reason why Micah would bring Joe along if he wasn't a solid gunslinger. And while John does eventually literally easily kill him during American Venom, I feel like at least he's a solid average gunslinger. And while he kind of gets killed because of you're playing against John, who's just an overpowered character because you play as him as the character, I think he's solid enough in a fight to take care of himself. So I think he also has to go into B tier. In 14th place, I've got Cleet. Pretty similarly to Joe, Micah's not going to bring him on board if he doesn't think he actually brings a little bit of firepower, but I don't think Cleet is the strongest guy. He's not doing anything super amazing, and I don't think he's a crazy killer. I think Joe probably is better physically wise, but it seemed like he just got gunned down really easily, and like Clee at least is like a little bit more sly, so I put him a little bit higher. But these guys are pretty much even, and because you don't really get to see enough out of them to put them any higher than B tier. In 13th place, I got Lee Gray. I think Lee Gray is a solid character and like, you know, is solid enough at fighting. Like clearly he's a sheriff of Rhodes, and you know he knows how to fight, but I don't think there's anything special going on with him, or I'd be like, oh my god, this is the craziest fighter ever. I don't think there's anything like bad either. Like I think he's just a pretty average gunslinger, and while he knows how to fight, he kind of gets clapped up by Arthur when he goes into Deadeye mode. So I don't know. I can't really put him any higher than B tier, but I definitely think he is a solid enough fighter to at least go into B tier. So he's a B tier, average gunslinger tier. In 12th place, I've got Javier S. Javier is also a pretty solid fighter. I mean, I think he's better than some people in the gang, but I definitely think he's on the lower end just because you don't really get to see him do any amazing things where I'd be like, oh my god, Javier's the craziest gunslinger ever. But you know, he still is solid enough and can take care of himself in basically any situation. So I think he has to go at least in B tier. He's a pretty solid fighter, and he basically just carries his weight as much as anyone else in the gang, but he doesn't really do anything special to go any higher than B tier in my opinion, so he has to go B tier. In 11th place, I got Eagle Flies. I think Eagle Flies is another solid fighter. Like, he's pretty good at fighting most of the time, but I think he just gets a little bit too much in his own emotions, and that kind of pushes him forward sometimes. So we'll get into fights that he really can't win all the time. I think that's what has to put him like out of A tier, but I still think he's a really solid fighter, and the fact that he knows how to like use bow and arrow and all that, and like he knows how to use a multitude of different weapons has to put him higher than someone like Javier. But at the same time, I don't think he's like so good of a fighter that he has to go into A tier, and I think you don't really get to see enough out of him being an amazing fighter to put him any higher than B tier. In 10th place, I've got Shawn Maguire. I think Shawn Maguire is pretty solid fighter. I think especially because he was running on his own for a while, he has to be a solid fighter. But you don't really get to see anything in the gang where I'd be like, oh my god, Shawn is like the craziest fighter ever. He's so much better than all these other people and just is a crazy fighter in his own thing. So I don't know. I think he's a solid fighter, but there's nothing special where I'd be like, oh my god, Shawn is so much better than some of these other people and has to go into A tier. I think he's just at the very, very top of B tier because he's still a really, really solid fighter, and the fact that he was on his own for a while shows that he's a solid fighter, but I don't think there's anything special which puts him above any of these other gunslingers in B tier, so he has to go into B tier as well. In 9th place, I've got KOMODriscoll. I think KOMODriscoll, might not be as amazing as some of the people in B tier, at least in his current state, but the fact that he was running a gang and the whole time he was basically just sending them all to their deaths, and like, I don't know, I feel like he's a solid gunslinger even now. He probably, rivaled Dutch in his heyday, where they're both like pretty solid gunslingers in their own right. So I think he has to go into A tier. He's also just a super cunning person and like smart in his own way. He's always going to finesse his way out of a situation if he can. I mean, you clearly see it when he does eventually get hung. He doesn't, fear anything at all until he actually does get hung. So I think because he's smart and he's also probably good at fighting, he has to go into A tier, and he's a really good gunslinger. In 8th place, I've got Dutch Van der Linde. I think Dutch is also a really good gunslinger, at least he was in his heyday, because he got to teach both John and Arthur, and they're both like Deadeye caliber shooters, and the fact that they're both Deadeye caliber shooters and like Dutch taught them means that he was probably up to the same level. And especially when you get to see some of his exploits in Red Dead Redemption 1, he has really good accuracy and probably is similar in terms of like Deadeye ability. But you don't really get to see that like ability as much in Red Dead Redemption 2. You don't get to see him shoot that much, but like when he does, he still is a very, very solid fighter. And I just think the fact that he did teach both Arthur and John, who are like insane fighters, has to put him at least in A tier, because it shows that he also had some probably pretty crazy abilities in his heyday. In 7th place, I've got Sadie Adler. I think Sadie is also a very, very capable fighter. I mean, clearly she is, because she just fights off a bunch of O'Driscolls all the time. And I think she has to go into A tier at least, because she does clear out Hanging Dog Ranch full of the last of the O'Driscolls, with or without Arthur. So, like, Arthur could help her and finish them off, but, I mean, canonly, like, she does do it even if Arthur doesn't help her. So I feel like that has to put her at least into A tier. There's like 30 different O'Driscolls there, and picking them off has to show that she's an absolute demon in combat. I mean, clearly not as good as like the top couple people, but she still is a very, very good fighter and can hold her own with basically anyone in the entire game. So I think she has to go at least into A tier. In 5th place, I've got Bill Williamson. Bill is actually a really, really good fighter. I think he's just a tank the entire time. He's a really big body, and I think physically, like fighting hand versus hand is probably really strong in that aspect. And just the fact that like in Red Dead Redemption 1, he does eventually become like the gang leader of all of New Austin and runs one of the most vicious gangs there, shows that his physical fighting ability like actually helped people join his gang and everything. And while he is one of the stupidest people in the entire game, I think his physical ability like really, makes up for that whole thing. And I don't know, I think he's a really, really strong character in general and has to be at least an A tier fighter just because of like what he does in Red Dead Redemption 1, and he's just a really solid fighter in Red Dead Redemption 2 the whole game. In 4th place, it's Charles Smith. While Charles might not be the best like fighter compared to some of these other people, especially with guns, he's good with bows, he's good with guns, he's also really good at fighting hand to hand. I just think in general, Charles has to be one of the strongest fighters in the entire game. And it's like he can do so many different things. He's pretty solid at sneaking up on people. He's pretty solid just fighting openly. And he's just great at fighting hand to hand. So I think all those things really turn him into like one of the best fighters in the game. And while he might not be the best at any of those things, he's like probably A tier for every single one of them, which turns him at least into an A tier fighter. While I don't think he's as good of a gunslinger as any of the top 3, he's probably better at stealth and at hand-to-hand combat than any of them, but still only can go into A tier just because of how good these other guys are. In 3rd place, it's Micah Bell. Micah Bell's an absolutely amazing fighter, in my opinion. There's a reason why this guy fought his way out of Strawberry and also just like carried roads. You also can see like whenever Arthur stops fighting, Micah's still shooting, and like I feel like every single time it's Arthur and Micah, they always get into gunfights, and every single time they fight out of it because those two are some of the best fighters in the entire game and in the gang in general. So I don't know, I feel like they have to be some of the strongest characters, and while Micah doesn't have the overpowered abilities that the top 2 guys have, he still is probably the strongest fighter in the game besides them, especially gunslinging wise. Every single time you're with Micah, he's always putting in good work, especially when like Arthur's not shooting against anyone. Like he is a good fighter, and when you're with John and like eventually you do get to see Micah in the final thing, he does kind of like beat everyone in a way. Like he's pretty smart and cunning in his own way, and I think he just like has a lot of like fight intelligence. So I think he definitely has to go at the top of A tier, but he can't go into S tier just because these 2 other characters are way too OP. In 2nd place, it's John Marson. Clearly, like, this guy is a great fighter. I mean, American Venom, he fights off, like, 50 people, basically all by himself. I just think in general, the fact that he can use Deadeye, even though technically, like, canon-wise, I don't think he's, like, starting to use Deadeye until Red Dead Redemption 1 because, like, you have to build up your Deadeye again in that game. So, like, technically, he's probably just starting to use Deadeye and, like, isn't that good at it in Red Dead Redemption 2 in the epilogue, but still is an amazing fighter nonetheless, and, like, is still just really solid on his own. Even in the rest of the game, he'd probably be A tier, but the fact that he can use Deadeye and, like, technically his maxed out ability in Deadeye because he kind of inherits it from Arthur has to put him into S tier. And while I don't think he's as strong of a fighter as Arthur is, he still is an amazing fighter nonetheless. And just the fact that in American Venom, he fights off all these dudes here has to put him into S tier. So John Marston is for sure an S tier Terminator level threat in Red Dead Redemption 2 in terms of combat ability because he could literally fight off a whole army of people and still be chilling. In 1st place, it's of course Arthur Morgan. He's literally everything John is in Red Dead Redemption 2, but just like supercharged to the max technically. Like technically John like inherits his stats, but I think canonically, I think Arthur in Red Dead Redemption 2 is probably as good of a fighter as John is in Red Dead Redemption 1 and Red Dead Redemption 2 combined. This guy's like an absolute menace here, and of course he kind of has to be overpowered as he's the player character and you play as him, but still he's a good fighter nonetheless. Like even if he was just like not the person you play as, this is like one of the best fighters, and it's always like you get back to camp and you don't kill anyone, and they're like, Micah comes up to you and he's like, oh, the the big, strong, tough guy, the shooter of the West, is finally getting soft. And it's like Arthur has a reputation for being like one of the scariest guys in the entire game. And other gangs will even be like, oh my God, it's the guy from the Vanderlyn gang that kills everyone. So he has to have one of the best reputations. And the fact that he's able to use Deadeye, which is just an overpowered ability, has to put him into S tier. So, I mean, Arthur Morgan clearly is the best fighter in all of Red Dead Redemption 2. And he's just such an overpowered character. So, I don't know. He easily has to be in first place, and clearly is Terminator level. He could probably take out like 10 different armies if he really had to. Alright guys, that wraps up my Red Dead Redemption combat ability tier list. If you guys would change anything, say it in the comments and I'll tell you exactly why I put it in a certain scenario. And if you guys do want to watch any more videos, they should be popping up right now, and you can watch a bunch more of my tier list. And if you do like those videos, then please subscribe to the channel.